Alrighty, folks, so we are back for the next chapter called Notes. Speaking of Courage was written in 1975 at the suggestion of Norman Bowker, who 3 years later hanged himself in the locker room of a YMCA in the hometown in central Iowa. In the spring of 1975, near the time of Saigon's final collapse, I received a long, disjointed letter in which Bowker described the problem of finding meaningful use for his life after the war. He had worked briefly as an automotive parts salesman, a janitor, a car wash attendant, and a short order cook at the local A&W fast food franchise. None of these jobs, he said, had lasted more than 10 weeks. He lived with his parents who supported him and who treated him with kindness and obvious love. At one point, he'd enrolled in a junior college in his hometown, but the coursework, he said, seemed too abstract, too distant, nothing real or tangible at stake, certainly not the stakes of a war. He dropped out after 8 months. He spent his mornings in his bed. The afternoons he played pickup basketball at the Y. And then at night he drove around town in his father's car, mostly alone or with a 6-pack of beer, cruising. The thing is, he wrote, there's no place to go, not in this lousy little town. In general, my life, it's almost like I got killed over in Nam. Hard to describe. That night the Kiowa got wasted, I sort of sank down into the sewage with him. Feels like I'm still in deep shit. The letter covered 17 handwritten pages, its tone jumping from self-pity to anger to irony to guilt to a kind of feigned indifference. I don't know what to feel. In the middle of the letter, for example, he reproached himself for complaining too much. God, this letter is starting to sound like some jerk-off vet crying into his beer. Sorry about that. I'm no basket case, not even any bad dreams. I don't feel like anybody mistreats me or anything, except sometimes people act too nice, too polite, like they're afraid they might ask the wrong question. But I shouldn't bitch. Like the one thing I hate. Hello. Sorry, had a little bit of a interruption there. Okay, so let's return. But I shouldn't bitch. One thing I really hate, is all of those whiner vets, guys sniveling about how they didn't get any parades. Such absolute crap. Who in his mind wants a parade or getting his back clapped by a bunch of patriotic idiots who don't know jack about what it feels like to kill people or get shot at or sleep in the rain or watch your Betty go down underneath the mud? Who needs it? Anyhow, I'm basically A-okay, home free. So why not come down and visit sometime and we'll chase pussy and shoot the breeze and tell each other old war lies. Good long bull session, I felt it coming near the end of the letter. And near the end of the letter, it came. He explained how he had read my first book, If I Die in a Combat Zone, which he liked except for the bleeding heart political parts. For half a page, we talked about how much the book had meant to him, how it brought back all kinds of memories, the villas and patties and rivers, and how he recognized most of the characters, including himself, even though almost all the names were changed. Then Bowker came straight out with it. What you should do, Tim, is write a story about a guy who feels like he got zapped over the shithole. A guy who can't get his act together and drives around town all day and can't think of a damn place to go and doesn't know how to get anywhere. This guy should talk about it. You can't. If you want, you can use the stuff in this letter, but not my real name, okay? I write it myself, except I'll never find the words, if you know what I mean. And I can't figure out exactly what to say. Say something about the field that night, the way Kiowa had just disappeared in the crud. You were there. You can tell it. Norman Bowker's letter hit me hard. For years, I felt a certain smugness about how easy I had made this shift from war to peace. A nice smooth glide, no flashbacks or midnight sweats. The war was over after all, and things do go on. So I took pride in sliding gracefully from Vietnam to graduate school. From Quang Ngai to Harvard, one world to another. In ordinary conversation, I never smoked much about the war, certainly not in detail. And yet, ever since my return, I've been talking about it virtually nonstop through my writing. Telling stories seemed natural, an inevitable process, like clearing the throat, partly catharsis, partly communication. It was a way of grabbing people by the shirt and explaining exactly what had happened to me, how I had allowed myself to get dragged into a wrong war, all the mistakes I made, all the terrible things I'd seen and done. I did not look on my work as therapy, and I still don't. Yet when I received Norman Backer's letter, it occurred to me that the act of writing had led me through a swirl of memories that might otherwise have ended in paralysis or worse. By telling stories, you objectify your own experience, so you take yourself out of it. You separate it from yourself. You pin down certain truths, you make up others. You start sometimes with an incident that truly happened, like the night in the ship field, and you carry it forward by inventing incidents that did not, in fact, occur, but then nonetheless help to clarify and explain. In any case, Norman Backer's letter had an effect. It haunted me for more than a month, not the words so much as its desperation. And I resolved finally to take him up on the story suggestion. At the time, I was working on a new novel, Going After Cacciato, and one morning I sat down and began a chapter said, Speaking of Courage. I collapsed into events of a single time and place, a car circling a lake on a quiet afternoon in midsummer, using the lake as a nucleus around which the story would orbit. As he'd requested, I did not use Norman Backer's name, instead substituting the name of my own novel's main character, Paul Berlin. But the scenery I borrowed heavily from my hometown, wholesale thievery, in fact. I lifted up Washington, Minnesota, the lake, the road, the causeway, the women and pedal pushers, the junior college, the handsome houses and docks and boats and public parks. I carried it all a few hundred miles south and transplanted it into Iowa prairie. The writing went quickly and easily. I drafted the piece in a week or two, fiddled with it for another week, and then published it as a separate short story. Almost immediately, though, there was a sense of failure. The details of Norman Backer's story were missing. In its original version, which I still conceived as part of the novel, I had been forced to omit the ship field and the rain. I had been forced to omit or leave out the ship field and the rain and the death of Kiowa, replacing this material with events that better fit the book's narrative. As a consequence, I lost the natural counterpoint balance between the lake and the field. The metaphoric unity was broken. What the piece needed and did not have was the terrible killing power of that ship field. As the novel developed over the next year, I had my own ideas clarified. It became apparent that the chapter had no proper home in this larger narrative. Going After Cacciato was a war story. Speaking of Courage was a post-war story. Two different time periods, two different sets of issues. There was no choice but to remove the chapter entirely. The mistake, in part, had been trying to wedge the piece into a novel. Beyond that, though, something about the story frightened me. I was afraid to speak directly, afraid to remember, and at the end, the piece had been ruined by a failure to tell the full and precise truth of our night in that ship field. Over the next few months, as it often happens, I managed to erase the story's flaws from my memory, taking pride in a shadowy, idealized recollection of its virtues. When the piece appeared in an anthology of short fiction, I sent a copy off to Norman Backer and thought that it might please him. His reaction was short and somewhat bitter. It's not terrible, he wrote me, but you left me out of Vietnam. But you left out Vietnam. Where's Kiowa? Where's the shit? 8 months later, he hanged himself. In August of 1968, his mother sent me a brief note explaining what had happened. He had been playing pickup basketball at the Y. After 2 hours, he went off for a drink of water. He used a jump rope. His friends found him hanging from a water pipe. There was no suicide note, no message of any kind. Norman was a quiet boy, his mother wrote. I don't suppose he wanted to bother anybody. Now, a decade after his death, I'm hoping that Speaking of Courage makes good on Norman Backer's silence. I hope it's a better story. Though the structure remains, the piece has been substantially revised, in some places by severe cutting, and other places by the addition of new material. Norman is back in the story, where he belongs, and I don't think he would mind that his real name appears. The central incident, our long night in that ship field along Song Trabong, has been restored to the piece. It was hard stuff to write. Kiowa, after all, had been a close friend, and for years I avoided thinking about his death and my own complicity in it. Even here, it's not easy. In the interest of truth, however, I want to make it clear that Norman Backer was in no way responsible for what happened to Kiowa. Norman did not experience a failure of nerve that night. He did not freeze up or lose a silver star for valor. That part of the story is my own. Okay, so I need to relax from that one and we'll get back to the next one. But hey, we're 65% of the way through the book, so we're making good progress. See you later.